Hello and welcome to Working Historians, a podcast series where we discuss what historians do with their lives. I am Rob Denning, Associate Dean for Liberal Arts for Southern New Hampshire University's online history programs. Today is June 17th, 2022, and on this date, 50 years ago, a bunch of ne'er-do-wells operating on behalf of President Richard Nixon's re-election campaign broke into the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee at the Watergate office complex in Washington, D.C., and in doing so sparked a constitutional crisis. In remembrance of that event, I present to you a panel of historians who have studied the event, who will discuss the international and domestic political contexts of Watergate, the break-in and investigations, and the long and short-term consequences of this episode on American political and constitutional history. So before we get into talking about, the context of Watergate, what happened in Watergate, the consequences of Watergate, I'd like to introduce the folks who are going to be talking about Watergate here today. So I'm going to go around and let them introduce themselves. I'll just name a participant, and if you could give us like I said, a one or two sentence introduction to who you are, what's your name, what do you do, and we'll go from there. So let's start with Adam. Can you introduce yourself?
Sure. My name's Adam Lehman. I'm an associate professor of history at Guilford Technical Community College in North Carolina.
Mike, can you introduce yourself?
Yes. Mike Green. I teach for Southern New Hampshire University. Right now as an adjunct, but I also teach at SUNY Polytechnic Institute here in Utica, New York.
Great.
Mostly American history, though.
Thank you. Eric, can you introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Eric Morganson. I'm teaching at a couple schools around here in Denver, and then also at SNHU. I'm a historian of modern Jewish history and modern neoconservatism.
And Ryan, can you introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm Ryan Tripp. I teach here at SNU as an adjunct. I also teach at Los Banos College and a variety of other California community colleges and universities. I guess my teaching record runs the gamut of U.S. and world history.
And Joel, can you round us out?
My name is Joel Cherney. I am an adjunct at Southern New Hampshire University teaching general history, but also Civil War. And I also have a large amount of work in post-World War II history, particularly Cold War. I also host podcasts on the New Books Network, mostly dealing with film, but I also do history and political related interviews as well.
All right, great. So we have a really informed group of participants for this roundtable here, so I'm looking forward to seeing where we go with this. So since we are historians, we can never really just focus on the immediate matter at hand. I figure we can start by talking about the context in which the Watergate incident, whatever you want to call it, break-in and then the cover-up and all of that. Let's talk a little bit about the context in which that happened. So what was going on in the world? We'll start kind of at the world level, and then we'll zoom in on the domestic politics a little bit. But if we could talk with, let's start with Adam and Mike. What was going on in the world in the years before the Watergate break-in that you think are relevant to this discussion?
Well, I usually start with more than the domestic at the time because, the United States is going through this huge division in the United States. 1968 was of course, pivotal year for presidential elections. We had another nail biter that year with the three people winning. And Nixon becomes, of course, barely wins that election, popular vote wise. And so Nixon coming into this election, he had promised to win the war in Vietnam. He had a secret plan. He really didn't have one, as we know. But he promised to bring the country together, and he wouldn't do that. And so Watergate kind of begins at this beginning where in the early stages of the Nixon administration, during the transition, Henry Kissinger, who becomes the National Security Advisor, brings in Daniel Ellsberg, who had been a consultant for, of course, the Defense Department for many years and had wrote the McNamara Report, which is, help get involved with the McNamara Report is what we call the Pentagon Papers, which, talks about the entire history of Vietnam. And so we've got a lot of turmoil going on in the country, a lot of division much like we see today, unfortunately, but in a different way. I mean, people were really divided over the issue of Vietnam, and Nixon again wants to win this war. He wants to win the war. That's how he wants to end it, but that's not what he never really got specific about what he was going to do. And eventually, as a result of this, what happens, of course, is the Daniel Ellsberg, who has been working for the working for the Defense Department. He was a former Marine and had been in Vietnam. He knew what was going on in Vietnam. And so Kissinger, asks him in a very good point blank, what's going on, and how can we win this war? And Ellsberg's trying to kind of nicely tell the new national security advisor, there's really no way we can really win this war because this is, we've been doing this for almost 20 years now, and it's not, we haven't really done very well without getting into too many details there. And so that's where we kind of start getting into this attitude that starts to form in the Nixon White House, sort of the us versus them kind of attitude among the people who are anti-war versus Nixon, who is a Cold Warrior, and thinking, of course, that Vietnam is a honorable mission, that we have to save the world from democracy. Or excuse me, communism. I knew I was going to say that. Save the world for democracy, but you know where I'm going. And so, this is where, this attitude starts. And finally, when Ellsberg, who becomes famous for leaking these Pentagon papers, the Kissinger just goes nuts. And he tells Nixon, look, if you don't crack down on these leaks, nobody will trust you in the world. Nobody will listen to you. And of course, this is where his chief of staff and his policy advisor, Bob Haldeman and John Ehrlichman, get together, and they start to form what we now call the Plumbers.
So you got to look at Nixon's actions sort of in context of a much more broader and global perspective, because Nixon inherited, I'm going to say, probably, a complicated mess to start with. Mm-hmm. That because he was vice president under Eisenhower, and so he's kind of stuck with both the Truman Doctrine and the Eisenhower Doctrine, to where he's got to try to contain communism. And so he was one of the guys who tried to establish SEATO, which was the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, which was supposed to be very similar to NATO, but unfortunately, it did not. That just did not work well together. And so he's trying to stem the tide from Vietnam. And as a result, it puts him in really an awkward position, because he lost the Kennedy for the presidency, and then he lost the governor race in California, and so everybody kind of wrote Nixon off. They kind of thought, right, he wasn't going to be able to do anything, and so part of his comeback strategy in '68 was to basically try to achieve peace with honor in Vietnam, because and as a result, he's after the Pentagon Papers come out, now he just starts looking. The paranoia takes over. One of the reasons that he was able to be so successful in '68 against the Democratic Party was they were divided after the assassination of Bobby Kennedy, and
right.
So there's all this. So I don't think Nixon thought he could win in '72 without kind of going to these measures, because you can see him reach out to Moscow, to reach out to Beijing, and he visits both Russia and China in an effort to kind of put a lid on Vietnam, trying to basically find a way to extradite American troops through the Vietnamization after he gets elected in '68, and all of his plans, the Pentagon Papers that just kind of blew that up, and he never quite recovered. I don't think it ever, when you look at it in the context of the Cold War, and '68 is really one of those pivotal years, because that's when the Russians rolled into Hungary and stomped down on the reforms that they were trying to do. And it just you had a lot of civil unrest, because 68 is also the year when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. So you have uprisings within the United States. So Nixon's sort of this law and order candidate where he has to. It's almost like he pushes himself to take extreme measures to achieve his goals.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, don't forget in '68 you had all these other protests, like in places like France. Because De Gaulle, of all people, De Gaulle ends up, leaving the presidency, and it's within that context, Adam's absolutely right, because within that context, Nixon, what he does is this is where you get the formation of what later becomes what they called the Houston Plan, but actually becomes this, operation to, keep tabs on their enemies. They call them the plumbers because they're going to plug the leaks. How clever. And, the first thing that the plumbers unit does is they're trying to, on the one hand, be legitimate on the world stage, go to Moscow, go to Beijing. I mean, these were great achievements too. I mean, we can't dismiss that. And at the same time, Nixon finds out that, all these communist countries who, the USSR, but in particular China, who we kept saying, well, they're involved in North Vietnam. He finds out that they're not as involved as they really were. I mean, they may have been given weapons to the North Vietnamese, but really they're not calling the shots that we suspected. So, and again, we have to have this sort of shift in policy afterwards. And at the same time, during this period, it's these plumbers who are trying to, at home, have sort of a domestic campaign, this covert campaign to discredit their quote unquote enemies, those anti-war people who are somehow, there's this thing that they think they're sort of backed by, some of the communist left-wing groups or whatever. And that's not necessarily true, of course. And this is where you get the break-in in September of 1971 of Dr. Fielding's office in, I think, San Francisco or something like that. It was Daniel Ellsberg, psychiatrist. They were trying to get the dirt on Daniel Ellsberg. And so this is where that kind of mentality begins. And as Al's right, Nixon comes in here. He's a cold warrior, and we're going to be strong, and we're not going to, show any weakness in this kind of atmosphere. And that's sort of how this paranoia starts to begin.
Yeah, thank you for that. And let's talk a little bit about the other kind of aspects of the domestic political situation in the U.S. around the time that Nixon was first elected, and then moving into 72 when he got reelected. Let's hear from Eric and Ryan a bit about what was the political spectrum? What did it look like in 1968, and how did that contribute to? We've touched a little bit on how it contributed to Nixon's kind of personal paranoia, but how did it set the stage for what came later in the late 60s and early 70s? What was going on in the kind of the domestic political sphere at that point?
I can talk a little bit about the Democrats, and then we can shift over perhaps to the Republicans. Eric, does that sound fine to you?
Yeah, that sounds good to me.
All right. So around 1968, what you're seeing is, of course, LBJ has decided not to run again for president. Well, was it ultimately his decision or not? I mean, he's pretty much pressured by the party. You see a number of candidates begin to separate themselves, from the LBJ administration and from the Democratic Party, particularly after or the events leading up to the DNC, the Democratic National Convention, and the protests there, the Chicago 7, etc. And, a number of the candidates are not really that into LBJ representing the Democratic Party anymore. I mean, chief among them, of course, is Robert F. Kennedy, correct? He's becomes really the leading candidate for the Democratic Party pretty quickly. He, of course, is assassinated, and that kind of takes it really shakes the Democratic Party to the core. They end up going with Hubert Humphrey from Minnesota, who is, I mean, he's a well-known political figure, but a lot of people don't really know him. Yeah, exactly. I mean, he really wanted to be a little bit more well-known, promoted himself as a national candidate. He's already affiliated with the Johnson administration, but a lot of people aren't really familiar with him as a presidential candidate. That said, he makes a go of it, and of course, Nixon triumphs. Now, I think I also wanted to add too that in the late 60s and going into the early 70s, you're also seeing the kind of the dissolution of the Great Society and the War on Poverty, right? And what does this have to do with Watergate? Well, I think in some ways, there's circulating ideas regarding, the so-called Rockefeller cabinet, the Rockefeller Republicans, the moderate Republicans, and, different ways that the Nixon administration approaches ideas of poverty, and there's kind of ethno-racial underpinnings to this, and I'm sure Eric will go into that during Nixon's first term. But we're definitely seeing Republican committees in Congress questioning the dispersal of funds and how funds are used through the war on poverty. And finally, too, we have the looming specter of OPEC, which actually has more to do with the public's reactions to Watergate than anything else. So at least in the late 60s and early 70s, that's what I'm seeing. And then, of course, to the McGovern campaign and the Watergate babies after in the early 70s. But I'm sure we'll talk about that later.
Yeah, we can come back to that in a sec. So, Eric, what do you think about the Republicans at that point?
Sure. I'm actually going to go back a little bit to 1964 in my discussion, and just kind of to give an idea, a little bit of context as to what Republicans were having to deal with, right? Like what Nixon was kind of trying to, in some way, separate himself from, but also try and embrace, and that's the Goldwater campaign in 1964. So just a little bit background. Barry Goldwater was very, very, very conservative by his own, by his own stance. He was very, very conservative, and he's probably most famous in history for the advertisement that I like to show in class, the famous Daisy ad that didn't air very much, but kind of became emblematic of the 1964 election, where it's a little girl, playing with a flower, and then there's a nuclear bomb that goes off, and it was basically saying if you vote for Goldwater, you're voting for nuclear war, right? And so you had this very, very conservative Republican as the nominee. He's going to lose to LBJ, and Nixon is kind of in a position where Goldwater gets a lot of the core Republicans very excited, right? That core conservative group, but he clearly can't get anybody else excited, right? He loses in a landslide in '64, and so in this kind of national context, Republicans had just lost this last national election by this huge margin, and Nixon kind of needs this support of these core conservatives, but he also needs to expand a little bit, right? Goldwater is very much anti-New Deal. The New Deal is still relatively popular at this time, although there are historians who argue that this 1968 election is kind of this changing point with the rise of the right and the rise of the Republican Party. But right now, the New Deal is at least popular enough that most people don't want to dismantle it, right? Don't want to do kind of a Goldwater to it. So the Republican Party is having to work within that context. And one thing that I thought was interesting, and in dealing with all of the trying to reset the Republican Party a little bit, and then also dealing with all of this political chaos and social chaos going on at home, I actually looked up the Republican Party platform from 1968, and I found a very interesting, it's very interesting mix of, we want local control, but then we also support some of these New Deal type of programs, right? They talk about things like healthcare, right? And some of it reads as what you could read today is almost liberal, right? And it's reading of what the Republican Party in 1968 wants. And so it's this mix of kind of the local control that Goldwater really wanted, right? He was very much probably more in line with Republicans now, where it's, this emphasis on what's going on. We want local control over things, but then also a more liberal, I wouldn't say an embrace of the New Deal, but at least, they're not rejecting the New Deal. So there's a quote from this Republican Party platform that I thought was really interesting. It says, "A peaceful, reunified America with opportunity and orderly progress for all. These are our overriding domestic goals," right? So they're trying to present themselves as this party of unity, right? The party that brings everybody together in this chaos of the late 1960s, with riots going on in the cities, with the Vietnam War, with the assassination of Martin Luther King, all of these various political assassinations, right? And all this political violence. So the Republican Party is trying to, you get this idea of the silent majority, right? That Nixon really starts to articulate a little bit later on. But he's trying to appeal to people who want calm, right? They want this calm. And at the same time, you see kind of the racialized undertones of the Nixon administration too. We're talking about things, like law and order and kind of urban violence. And so he's really trying to, in some ways, rebuild, I would argue, rebuild the Republican Party a little bit, like make it a little bit more mainstream than under Goldwater, but then also trying to play up some of these divisions that are going on, right? Some of the racialized divisions, some of the kind of urban versus suburban divisions, right? Divisions over the Vietnam War. And so at the same time that you see the Republican Party kind of vocalizing, hey, we're trying to unify everybody, you also see, stoking of these divisions, right? And trying to play up these divisions as much as possible. So it's kind of this interesting, almost a dichotomy between the two and what the Republican Party is doing.
Yeah, I like the way you kind of put that they're trying to rebuild the Republicans, and that's certainly the case for not just Nixon, but there were others that were trying to do that too. My own research into Ronald Reagan when he was governor of California in the late 60s, early 70s was kind of just like that. That he was trying to put together a Republican coalition in California that is different. The electorate in California was different than the electorate, at large across the United States. But he was trying to put together a new Republican Party that was based on kind of efficiency, cooperation, collaboration, almost bipartisanship. It was in kind of stark contrast to what happened when he became president, 15 years later. But while he was in office in California, I mean, that was when California took the lead on environmental protections, for example. So there was a huge constituency within the Republican Party for clean air regulations and clean water regulations. And so it was a very different Republican Party, of course, than exists today. It was much more of a kind of a coalition of different groups. There were certainly the Goldwater conservatives, who were all small government, low taxes and all that. But there were also other factions within the party that were trying to embrace, like you said, at the national level, trying to embrace or at least continue on the popular New Deal policies, and even some Great Society policies that were very popular. But in California, yeah, Reagan was, Reagan signed one of the country's most expansive laws allowing abortion. And so there were a lot of ways that the Republicans were trying to kind of demonstrate or kind of present themselves as the mainstream America. I think that's probably a good way to put it. And in doing so, attract votes from the Democrats. And then like Eric and Ryan, both of you mentioned that the Democrats were pretty much falling apart at that point. You think about the 1968 Democratic Convention when there were all the riots outside and there were people nominating, forget which group it was that actually nominated a pig for president out in the parking lot outside of the Democratic Convention. So it looked like the Democrats were kind of scattered, especially in the wake of Robert Kennedy's death, the Democrats were kind of falling apart. The Republicans were kind of trying to present themselves as, like you said, the new kind of silent majority. Let's bring everybody together. But in doing so, we're going to have to kind of take on a much more mainstream, at least face. But also, again, with like the environmental regulation, with abortion, all that, there was a much greater kind of sense of we need to have more of a bipartisan kind of coalition view towards it. So with all of that said, that we've got the kind of that political context, let's focus on Nixon, because of course he's the central player in all of this discussion about Watergate and all of that. So, Joel, we've kind of been we've been mentioning Nixon's various issues, his paranoia, his kind of obsession with security and all that. We've talked about that kind of in the context of the Cold War, in the context of Vietnam. So what can you tell us about Nixon the man? Let's focus on him, and then we can talk a little bit about, how that led to things like Watergate and all of that.
Well, one of the things that comes out of reading and learning, and the thing about Nixon is there's so much information available about him, probably partly from his own self. He was not somebody who was shy about writing, particularly, between his memoirs afterwards. But there's a lot of information available about Nixon. The only negative I find sometimes is that, and it's one of those things with writing history, you want to try to avoid psychoanalyzing. And unfortunately, of all people that I can think of, especially even when he was in office or around that period of time, it seems like a lot of writers loved to try to psychoanalyze him. And over time, we've gotten all this information that everybody claims this is why he was the way he was. And I think we need to be careful of those kind of things because, as we know, psychohistory is not something that you can necessarily trust. But having said all that, he was born in the 19-teens, was a little older than John Kennedy, and in fact, as over time, he and Kennedy were friends. They both served in World War II in the Navy. He was born in California to Quaker parents. One of the things you got to remember is when you think Quaker, there's multiple Quaker groups. It wasn't exactly the same kind of Quakers that we think of often with the total, the nonviolence and peace aspect, although he had some of that as from his mother. Over time, he grew into a large family, of which two of whom died while he was still at home, one from tuberculosis, which we don't know that now, but when we talk about diseases, tuberculosis was a terrible disease in the period, and many people died from it. And then he also had another brother who died. And then over time, his family was poor, very poor. His father could not grow oranges in California, which, if you know anything about California, is somewhat unusual. So obviously he was not able to go to big schools. His hope was to go away to school and lemon, as I say, not oranges, it was lemons, but still it's the same concept. So he went to Whittier College, which is in California, in the conservative area of California. Remember, California, as big as it is, even back then, had its liberal and conservative as it does now. So it's not all, for what we want to say sometimes, it's not all liberals, and even then it wasn't. So he graduated from college, ends up going to Yale for law school, even though he went away for it, but he had a full scholarship for it, earned a degree, applied to work at the FBI of all places, and did not get accepted. Years later, he did talk with J. Edgar Hoover about it. Anyway, so he comes back to California, and of course at this point then World War II begins, and he gets involved first off in the United States, working on various aspects relating to supplies, but then he asks to go overseas, goes over, wasn't involved in combat, but certainly was in areas that were under combat. So he definitely qualifies as a World War II veteran who saw combat. comes back, and as soon as he gets back to the United States, almost while he's still in the service, although he knows he's getting out soon, he's approached by a group of a group of people in California, asking him if he wants to run for Congress in a district that had a Jerry Voorhees, who was a liberal congressman, had been in the office for quite a while. The Republicans obviously wanted somebody who could beat him, so he accepts. It ends up being a much more difficult campaign at first because of money issues more than anything. And it gets to the point that early on, even in this first campaign of his, where getting money becomes an issue. And this would be something we would see in his later campaigns as well. But eventually he wins the primary very easily and then turns on Voorhees and starts almost immediately with what we would call these days dirty tricks and terrible advertising. He would come out with a list of things that Voorhees voted on in Congress and would then point it out like, here's what the socialist or the left-wingers in Congress and the voted on, and they would always be the same. And of course, Voorhees, the biggest problem he ran into more than anything was that he just didn't take Nixon seriously early on. And by the time he did, it was too late. He participated in debates with Nixon, and Nixon wiped the floor with him. Nixon ends up winning the race, becomes congressman in 1946, runs again in 1948, wins again. During this 4-year period, up between 48 and 50, or 46 and 50, he gets involved in the House Un-American Activities Committee and immediately gets involved, and this is where Alger Hiss and the famous Alger Hiss situation and trial and so on. And so clearly he gets involved in the idea of wanting to be pro. In the Cold War, he obviously felt that this was his calling. He would eventually be proven right to a large extent about Alger Hiss. I know at the time people didn't want to believe it, but there has been pretty definite proof that Hiss was definitely passing along information. But so then in 1950, he decided, it's a decision that he's going to run for Senate for California, rather move on to Senate. And once again, he runs against a Democratic Congresswoman, Helen Gahagan Douglas, who was running on the Democratic ticket. And once again, he begins referring to her as the Pink Lady. The whole thing of let's talk about what we can do to downgrade the other person and innuendo and things like that, ends up winning that Senate seat in 1950. And then 2 years later, when Eisenhower runs for president in 1952, for a variety of reasons, Nixon is selected as his vice presidential nominee. Almost immediately after getting the vice presidential nomination, a story comes out about a slush fund that supposedly Nixon has that he's using for personal expenses. Obviously, over time, as Nixon, one of the things, and this would be the area where it really started, Nixon was always known for being very anti-press. He was the first person I can ever think of who referred to the press as the enemy, even though we've had that happen since. But Nixon, other candidates were doing the same thing. The Adlai Stevenson, who was the Democratic candidate for president, he had an extra fund as well. But for whatever reason, Nixon's fund became the news. And unfortunately, he and Eisenhower, even though Eisenhower, over the 8 years that they served together, would have him do a lot of things and felt he did a lot of things well, they were never very close. And almost immediately when the slush fund stories start to come out, Eisenhower's almost ready to dump him already, not even giving him a chance to do anything. Well, in the end, Nixon gets himself taken out of the problem by appearing on television, which at the time was something that was incredibly unusual. Think to yourself, in 1952, television was still in its reasonable infancy. We're only talking about 5 years after it first started appearing in households. And Yet he is able to come up with a speech that you can still see. It's available on YouTube and a variety of different places. There's actually a whole book that's just about the Chequers speech, in which he is able to prove, as far as he's concerned, and get support. Later on, while the speech is going on, the mainstream Republican leaders are looking at it and laughing at it, almost saying there's no way in the world this is going to work. They're all set to wait for him to be dumped. And yet the people who were most likely going to be the voters overwhelmingly supported him. He obviously stays on the ticket, and for the next 8 years, he's the vice president of the United States. Then we come up, there's obviously during that 8 years, there's a lot of stuff that goes on, but we don't need to go into huge detail about all of it. So then we come to 1960. Once again, he feels he should be able to be the one, and he runs for president of the United States when Eisenhower's about to retire. Loses to Kennedy in 1960. Once again, debates become an interesting aspect of the whole thing. Although there's still a lot of question as to whether the debates won him or lost it for him. It's one of those things where a lot of folks will say different things. Barely wins. Most likely, or very likely, there were some shenanigans in Illinois and Texas for the Democrats. No proof, but no definite proof, but there seems to be some issues. But he concedes. Kennedy wins, and Nixon theoretically is now done with running for politics for now. Doesn't say he's done completely, but as we talked about a little earlier, 1962 he runs for governor of California. Most people at the time weren't real happy. Republicans weren't happy with his campaign because it seemed almost like he was running for president. He kept talking about national issues and didn't seem to show that much interest in issues going on in California. But he gave a good raise, but still lost. And of course, then promptly announces that was he has his final press conference, or what he called his last press conference, and everybody wrote him off. He's done. Well, during the next 4 years or 6 years, he works as a lawyer, makes some money, meets various people who end up being much help to him as he goes forward. He'd already met H.R. Haldeman by this point and Ehrlichman, and left. And at that point, then he's acting like he's not going to run again, but almost immediately he starts getting involved in politics again. While he isn't a major player in the 1964 election, he definitely supported Goldwater. He went around and spoke for Goldwater. He was at the convention speaking for Goldwater. And the major Republicans, the people, the major people who were in the party really appreciated everything he did. Even though, of course, as we've said, Goldwater fell apart, lost terribly. But then within 2 years after Goldwater, Nixon pretty much says, I'm coming back. This was prior to where the primaries did everything. Nowadays, we're just used to everything coming through with primaries. Back in the 60s and even before, primaries often weren't really that important. In fact, Hubert Humphrey, even though he ends up winning the Democratic nomination in 1968, did not enter a single primary. It was still a matter where the party made the decision, where the delegates actually could control what they did. Nowadays, it's almost impossible to go into a convention and not know who the candidate is. Well, Nixon has to fight. He's not going to necessarily win it all by himself. He goes with Rockefeller on the left. Rockefeller is considered a liberal Republican. Yes, there were such things back then. And on the right, he had this guy in California who had been elected governor recently, good old Ronald Reagan, who this is the first time Reagan decides he might get involved. He is in the background, and there's some worry at some point that the major conservatives still in the Republican Party are going to give the nomination to Reagan instead. But in the end, Nixon comes through the convention and becomes the nominee, and almost immediately gets off on the wrong foot by nominating Spiro Agnew as his vice presidential nominee. And one of the things that came out later is the fact that even back then, most people felt Spiro Agnew was one of the most crooked politicians ever to be in public office. So Nixon goes through the campaign, and as we've talked about, ends up winning by another small margin, this time on his side. There are issues related to that LBJ was trying to work out a peace treaty. He was trying to work out ceasefires, and there may have been some chicanery going on behind the scenes where Nixon may have been talking through intermediaries with the president of South Vietnam at the time, basically saying, don't do anything right now. You'll get better terms with me as president. Ends up winning. Of course, LBJ is not able to get a real peace treaty or even a ceasefire. Anyway, from that point on, Nixon becomes president. And by this point, one of the words, and I know we keep using the word paranoia, and I guess it works based on all the evidence we have. Nixon, by this point, is purely of the idea that he went from a very idealistic person right after World War II and ends up eventually becoming someone who doesn't trust anyone, barely even trusts his own people he works with. What we'll see over time and during his presidency is that he loved working through other people. He very seldom would make decisions directly himself, or he wouldn't be the one to tell people. A lot of what we've heard about comes with that. So immediately becomes president in 1969, gets involved trying to end Vietnam, going immediately with that. Unfortunately, 1969 ended up being the worst year as far as American deaths during the Nixon presidency. Statistic is a quarter of all Americans killed during Vietnam during his presidency died at the first few months of 1969. He decides to bomb Cambodia secretly. Yes, we have the chance to do things secretly still back then. Bombs Cambodia. It does come out. And immediately, Henry Kissinger, who ends up floating through all of this throughout, gets him going about how we have to stop these leaks. Somehow the story got out, and the first use of wiretapping right at the beginning of his administration. Wiretaps a number of people who were on Kissinger's staff, including people who theoretically were loyal to Kissinger. They never really find out who was the leak at the time. And it's soon after this that while the rioting that we've already talked about was going on, that a minor staffer in the White House named Tom Houston is asked to he says he can come together with a plan to somehow deal with some of these issues, from what they were calling the New Left to the rioters and all the other situations. So, of course, Houston develops what became known as the Houston Plan, even though it was a committee report. His name's not on the report. It's actually a committee of J. Edgar Hoover, head of the CIA, and a couple other people. And the Houston Plan is an interesting document to read, and yes, it's available. And in June of 1970, this is the plan. Of course, it never gets completely put into place because Hoover refused to go along with aspects of it. Suddenly Hoover, even though by this point had been done what they called dirty tricks or black bag operations, break-ins and everything. Well, the report asked for all these kinds of things, the plan. Eventually, parts of it do go into effect, particularly related to people who were being used as informants. For example, it used to be they had to be 21 or older. One of the things in the plan is to drop it down to 18, and suddenly that goes into effect. So by 1970, Nixon is very much in that streak of enemies, and what do we do to get around our enemies? So by February of 1971, which is only a few months later, this is when he has the taping system installed in February. LBJ, as we know now, was also taping. We did not know that. We didn't know that until long after. In fact, it was soon after we found out about Nixon's taping system in 1973. It was sometime after that we then discovered that LBJ, and then before that JFK, had taping as well. Nixon pulls out LBJ's when he first comes in, but then in February decides he wants to have a taping system, not necessarily to do anything other than to have a record of what was discussed. He's a big deal about having records. This is one of the other reasons why we know so much about what went on during Nixon's period of time in the White House and even before. He loved records. Everybody was writing. He would dictate dictaphone, which was a small tape recording system, at the end of the day regularly. There were all kinds of memos about everything. Everybody loved writing memos, and so there was a ton of those. H.R. Haldeman, who became his chief of staff, which at that point was still a reasonably new concept, was great on taking notes. In fact, we joked about the 18.5-minute gap in the taping system. Haldeman's notes is the only record that still has of what was discussed during that period, and supposedly Watergate was. But anyway, so the taping system goes into effect. Nothing much for the first few months, but then in June of 71, the day after his daughter, Tricia, is married on a Saturday, the Sunday morning, the next day is when the New York Times begins to publish the Pentagon Papers, which, of course, had nothing to do with the Nixon presidency. It was purely the report was written largely by Ellsberg and some other folks because Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense during LBJ's term and Kennedy's, wanted a background details about how we got into Vietnam. So Nixon at the first time it comes up, isn't overly concerned about it. It doesn't make him look bad. But then Henry Kissinger once again starts railing about information being available. Why is this stuff happening? And then, of course, as we've already discussed, this leads to the plumbers. And one of the things you hear, especially with the taping systems and all the memos, and this I think hits Nixon quite well to sort of finish up where we are. Nixon and many of the people worked about it, I would use the term amoral. They tended to rail about enemies a lot. They talk a lot about what people do to them and what they're going to do to them in return. Of course, the 72 election afterwards, there's major, we're going to get back at all these people who have been, quote unquote, screwing us. So it's not a big surprise, but at this point in Nixon's both his career as a politician and in the White House during that first term, that there were a lot of people who were working to either on, not necessarily on cross purposes, but certainly were doing what they thought he wanted them to do. Because he was one of those folks that would say all kinds of things. And one of the things you read about a lot from many of the memoirs that have come out, and there's 1,000 of them, it seems, just about everybody who was either accused or went to jail wrote a memoir as well after Watergate, is that they all had to learn when was he saying something that you had to do something about, and when could you ignore it. And I think in many ways, as we'll see with Watergate and some of the other things, sometimes it became out of people weren't always completely sure, and therefore was he really being honest about wanting certain things done or not? And while the cover-up will be a completely different thing, this early period before the break-in, the final break-in in Watergate, a lot of this happened because people just got out of control, thinking they were trying to do things that he wanted. And he may well have wanted them in general, but there's no real indication that he knew anything about the actual break-in going in to when it happened.
Great, thank you for that. And one of the issues that a lot of us tend to deal with, I think, when we teach this stuff in class is that a lot of people don't really the term Watergate has become kind of this massive kind of symbol of, scandal, political scandal. And let's talk about exactly what happened at Watergate. First off, what is Watergate? Where does the word come from? And what are we actually talking about here? We've mentioned that there's a break-in. What exactly happened there? Who would like to describe the actual break-in and what's going on with that?
Well, I can continue real quickly because then we can sort of use it as a starting point.
Okay.
One of the things to remember about Watergate and when it happens, while the Pentagon Papers and the plumbers were being used for political and things during the administration, by the time of Watergate, this was during the middle of the presidential election campaign in '72. So while the Ellsberg break-in was related to Pentagon Papers, Watergate was clearly, from every indication, related to the political campaign. Watergate is a hotel and office complex in Washington, D.C., still exists. It was reasonably new in 1972. And the Democratic National Committee had their offices in the Watergate. As it turns out, many of the people who were involved in the plumbers were also ended up being involved in this break-in. The Watergate burglars, what they would be known, on June 17th, 1972, which is almost 50 years ago, or 50, depending on when this comes out, 5 men were caught inside the Watergate offices of the Democratic National Committee. They had bugging equipment. They had sequential bills and quite a bit of it. They were all wearing gloves. They were 4 of the 5 were Cuban. One ends up being a member of the committee to reelect the president, Nixon's reelection committee, working for them as a security consultant, as it would later come out. Basically, what happened was somewhere prior to this actually happening, there was discussion, and we can use the name G. Gordon Liddy as the best example because he was the one who came up with what was known as Project Gemstone. And I know everything's got these names on it, but you get the Houston Plan and Project Gemstone. Gemstone was what he suggested that the committee to reelect the president did to assure that Nixon would win reelection. And there were break-ins involved and all these kinds of things. And of course, at some point, that was supposedly John Mitchell, Attorney General, and then head of the committee to reelect the president, had said no. But somewhere, something changed, and nobody knows for absolute certainty who gave the final approval. These men had actually gone into the Watergate prior to June 17th and installed some bugging equipment already. There was transcripts of bugging materials. All that material is still hidden. A lot of it got destroyed after the break-in, but there are some indications as to what they actually were trying to do. Soon after that, something was going wrong, and so they went in a second time on June 17th. Frank Wills, and I've got to mention his name because in many ways I think he's the true hero of Watergate, because if he didn't do what he did, he was a security guard at the Watergate. On the night of June 16th to the 17th, in that period of time, he was doing his rounds and he found a piece of masking tape on a door. The idea being that you put the tape over the lock and it keeps the door unlocked. Now, people who were workers might do that during the daytime, for example, when they're going in and out of doors so they don't have to keep unlocking it. But he pulls the tape off, closes the door. Next time he does his rounds through the same area, he discovers the tape is back. And that's what ends up being what had it happen. What happened is he calls the police immediately, and that's when the police show up. Turns out it was an undercover group of policemen. It was not uniformed, but there was a lookout across the street from the Watergate who immediately notices something bad's going on. It's reasonably well shown in All the President's Men, the movie. But in the end, the Watergate burglars are arrested, and that's where Watergate begins.
And then, of course, from that point on, we get into multiple investigations, which we could get into. It would probably take us, we could talk about this for a month to talk about all the various complicated investigations and court cases and all of that.
Well, I think the best thing to talk about, I think the investigations part of it is to remember that this was still, the election had not happened, the 72 election. Nixon was obviously going to run for president again, was going to end up winning a re-election in 72 and a landslide. But the first investigations, probably more came out of the newspaper than anybody else. We've now long since, if you've known of All the President's Men or Woodward and Bernstein, who even are both around today, they get sometimes too much credit. There were other reporters who were doing incredible amounts of investigating. Everything else was being done behind the scenes. So the first investigations were from the FBI, And then from there, and then eventually, as time goes on and more things come out, Nixon wins re-election with no problem. In fact, many times to this day, people, the people at the time were saying, why did he even do this? There was no reason to. People didn't believe he was involved because they said, why would he need to? Until now, what we know of his background. So I think so much of the investigating, including what would end up being a Senate investigation, a bunch of trials, and then, of course, impeachment investigations.
I can add a little bit to that. Especially I think Joel, or at least says that Woodward and Bernstein weren't the only reporters. They were I think pretty central, as was the Senate Watergate Committee, of course. And I think the Senate Watergate Committee is pretty interesting group of people, right? It's bipartisan, but it is spearheaded to a certain extent by Sam Ervin, who's a so-called Southern Democrat. And this kind of dovetails with something that I wanted to add about the Democratic Party in the events leading up to the Watergate break-in and the investigation, in that the New Left itself is kind of becoming a question of whether or not there is a New Left, what the New Left is, and I don't like using the word generational, but there's a historical question here in terms of Southern Democrats leaving the party for the Republicans, as we're all familiar with, but then those that stayed. And those elder Democrats that stayed are the new Democrats that we see in the 70s, around even before the Watergate break-in, not necessarily Watergate babies, even before that. What are their relationships with the elder Southern Democrats that remained in the Democratic Party? And this ties back directly into the Centergate Watergate Committee, because Sam Ervin is a pretty staunch Southern Democrat from North Carolina. He actually opposed civil rights legislation. He really was pretty staunch defender of segregation. Now, there are arguments that he shifted and began to differentiate civil rights from civil liberties, insofar that certain aspects of civil liberties through the Bill of Rights, etc., shouldn't apply to a variety of groups, but Sam Ervin definitely was or at least well before Watergate was a pro-segregationist. But then we also have Daniel White from Hawaii and Joseph Montoya from New Mexico, also on the Senate Watergate Committee, but then again we also have Henry Talmadge as well from Georgia. So I think the Centergate, at least for the Democratic side, the Senate Watergate Committee and the politics of it are really, really important for understanding the consequences of what happens after Watergate. Also, I wanted to add too that there's several staffers that are exactly Daniel White from Hawaii. There are one of the first Asian so-called self-identified. He was self-identified as Asian American, but he actually self-identified as Hawaiian in Congress. I wanted to mention too that there are several staff investigators going on. I mean, we think about the Senate Watergate Committee, but a lot of the staffers under these congressmen are really doing a lot of the investigation work, and this ties back into what Joel was saying about it wasn't just Woodward and Bernstein. One of the staffers was actually Hillary Clinton. Not many, I think not at least it might.
She was on the impeachment committee.
Yeah, exactly. Not a lot of people know that, and I think it's I think we should note that too. And then I think in terms of, I also wanted to add too that the taping systems began with FDR. I also wanted to note too that in terms of Woodward and Bernstein, there was questions too regarding their political affiliations towards the end of their series of articles on Watergate. And I do know that Woodward came from I believe it was a Republican family, something along those lines, but he was there was definitely many pundits and commentators were linking them, of course, to the Democratic Party, and then Bernstein, of course, was Democratic, I think, pretty explicitly. And then, of course, in terms of the investigation, we also have Deep Throat, correct? And that turned out to be Mark Felt, and I think it was Joel that sort of mentioned and discussed the sort of the body bag jobs by the FBI. Felt was kind of involved in all of that in the early 70s, and he actually received a lot of support from Nixon after Watergate because he was actually brought to trial and then subsequently pardoned by Reagan. Felt himself was a Democrat during the 70s, that then after Reagan's pardon becomes a Republican. So I do think in terms of the investigation and the politics of the investigation, I think is important in understanding what happens after. Yeah, he was overlooked by the FBI. That's correct. And I think, I do want to mention one more thing about Felt in terms of him being overlooked for the FBI. There's evidence through the tapes that there was numerous people in the Nixon administration that were questioning Felt as the source of the leak, not just to the Post, but also to the New York Times and several other newspapers. Now, the issue with that, putting that in context, was that there's also evidence on the tapes that, in terms, I think we're calling it paranoia, of Nixon questioning basically everybody as the leak. I mean, one can argue that Nixon anticipated and Haldeman and everybody else anticipated Felt as the source for the Post stories, but if you actually look at some of the studies, secondary source studies, as well as the tapes, transcriptions of the tapes themselves, he's actually accusing a variety of people for their not just for the taste, but for their loyalty in general to him, and uses the word loyalty over and over again. And then later on, he seems to be really, really cozy with Felt. I think he sends him gifts or something along those lines in the late 70s and early 80s. This is Nixon sending Felt gifts. So it's a historical question as to how much the Nixon administration kind of saw Felt as a potential leak and as a potential candidate for Deep Throat.
This is Mike again, and I was just going to chime in there because it's like, yeah, you're absolutely correct. Because Felt knew a lot about what was going on. Because remember, just like 4 or 5 days after the break-in, Haldeman and Nixon are on the tapes, and they're this is considered the quote unquote the smoking gun, where Nixon tells Haldeman to call the head of the FBI and say we need you to stop investigating this because the break-in, that is, because of course this is a CIA operation, and so Felt, it's later this makes a lot more sense, but actually what it's important to note that what Woodward and Bernstein always are careful to mention was that while Felt was a source, he was actually a somebody who verified things. He didn't really give them as much information as he verified pretty much everything that Woodward and Bernstein at certain points obtained. And so, he, in some ways, Felt, that's kind of a way that Felt could always say that, well, I didn't really turn over information as much as I verified, what was going on. I mean, that's where, back in the days where, in journalism, where if you had something, you needed 2 verifications. And, this is what, this is what we should probably go through today. The other question I was going to say is you guys mentioned this too, and I think that it was important, was that, it wasn't really the public. I want to get your impressions on this because I don't think the public was really paying much attention to this until in March of 1973, when the Senate begins the hearings tape, on live television. And they go, I don't remember how long they went on for. I was very young at the time. Let's just put it that way. I remember watching them because I think I was home from school one day and there was nothing else on. But so much for the flu. And but I was wondering if I think it's the Watergate hearings. Does that spawn the development for the special prosecutor that later comes about in 1973.
Actually, the special prosecutor came out from when in earlier 1973, when James McCord, after the first Watergate trial, where it was the burglars and Hunt and Liddy, he wrote a letter to Judge Sirica, who was the judge on the case, announcing that people had lied, people had there was a lot of information. By that point, the Senate had already formed a committee, but that helped to take it off. There's no question that putting the hearings on television helped. This was not the first time that happened. Nixon, during the McCarthy hearings, were often on television. The House Un-American Activities Committee were under. So basically, the very many investigations would show up on television. But yes, there's no question, because all the channels covered it. PBS at night would show the recordings for people who were working. And if actually they're all still available online, you can actually watch them even now if you want. So yes, there's no question that really went a long way to bringing it to the public attention. Of course, the main hearings didn't start until May on TV. The committee had already been working, and by that point, Nixon had already fired many of his people in April: Haldeman, Ehrlichman, and Dean. Of course, it's the Watergate committee hearings that finds the taping system. In July or August, a reasonably small staffer who they were just interviewing in passing, they thought there might be some taping going on because of some of the things that they were hearing from some of the witnesses. But as it turns out, this small staffer, Alexander Butterfield, and in fact, it's probably Woodward's last book on Watergate is related to Alexander Butterfield. He wrote a book about him after this all ended, or reasonably recently, but Butterfield's still alive. The taping system is announced, and that's when things really took off. From that point on, the taping system, once we know the taping system exists, from that point on, that's where everything goes, because suddenly everybody wants the tapes. That's when the courts get involved in detail, and we go from there to the end, to the impeachment investigation. When Nixon loses the tapes to the Supreme Court, loses the case, he knows the jig is up. They announce that they have this one tape. They put out the smoking gun tape that you've already mentioned. And soon after that is when Nixon resigns.
I just wanted to reiterate, I think, and I'm pretty sure I speak on behalf of all of us, we're not trying to completely downplay Woodward and Bernstein. They are very, very, very central, I think, at least to initiating several investigations, including the Senate investigation, too. In terms of people watching TV, I think also in 73, 74, I mean, we have I don't need to beat a dead horse here, but there's also the oil crisis going on. I mean, there's several issues, right, in U.S. and world politics that we've discussed, but definitely people are freaking out a little bit about the oil crisis and the various measures that the federal, state, and municipal authorities are taking to mitigate the oil crisis. And I think a lot of people are also watching too for as we've already discussed, a burgeoning environmental consciousness that I actually assign in a class for another school interviews on news shows with people talking both about Watergate, but then also talking about the oil crisis. People kind of talk about Watergate, and they become more and more, in the news stories, the television reporters become more and more focused on Watergate as the investigation proceeds, particularly when as I think Joel noted, that the tapes are released. But then they're also talking about the economy and the lack of fuel, or their impediments to accessing fuel, and that I think if there are people watching TV, and of course there's what's going on in the world from Cambodia to Vietnam, China.
All right, well, thank you for that summary of the investigations and all that. So let's talk a little bit about the longer term consequences of Watergate. I mean, beyond just the simplistic naming convention that we have every time there's a political scandal, where we just slap the name Gate at the end of it just to try to glamorize or exaggerate the importance of political scandals and all that. But let's talk about some of the longer term consequences of Watergate. What did this event and the follow up investigations and all that, what did that mean for American politics in the long term?
Yeah, for Republicans, it's kind of an interesting thing. I always wonder what the legacy of Nixon would be without Watergate, right? Because he had all, we talked about the EPA, we talked about kind of his mix of, states' rights kind of things, while still maybe not embracing the New Deal, but at least kind of, acknowledging the importance of the New Deal and kind of acting as this bridge, acting as this transition between this kind of the old, you could say, liberal organization versus this new emerging right-wing conservatism. And I wonder if the Nixon would be a more popular Republican without Watergate. I know this is a little bit of speculation, but he really did shape the direction of the Republican Party. And I almost wonder, if it wasn't for Watergate, would he have, would we have a different Republican Party, number one? And would he have a more prominent place in it, right? Because I think that really kind of damaged his stock among Republicans, right? He almost became a joke among Democrats, but it really kind of damaged his stock among Republicans, even though he really was this driving force in creating this new party, right? And kind of redirecting the party and making it, out of the ashes of 1964. He really kind of resurrected it. And, I almost, hesitate to give Nixon credit for things, right? But I'd say he almost kind of deserves credit for his politicking, if nothing else, right? And for kind of rebuilding the party. And I think Watergate really obviously destroyed his legacy, but I almost wonder what it would be without Watergate, right? Would we think of him as, not as a crook and as a, almost a joke in some cases, but, would it be this leader of this new Republican Party, or kind of the creator of this new Republican coalition?
Just to quickly add to that, Eric's right, because the Southern Strategy, as it was called, Nixon really begins in 1966 to not only is he trying to get named, but he really works in those congressional races across the country, and the Republicans make a strong comeback in congressional races in 1966. But at the same time, through the 70s and 80s, you start to see this change in the South in particular, and by the 1980s, you definitely see the change where the Democrats, those so-called Southern Democrats, I'm not trying to, I'm trying to poke fun, and maybe this can serve as a bridge to what Ryan will later say, was that, those Democrats in the South who were these conservative Southern Democrats who had, were kind of ending that long period of the solid South as, the place where the Democrats were. And by the 1980s, we're seeing this switch where you don't see people identifying themselves anymore as liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats. It's, by the end of the century, I would definitely say that, today, if somebody says that they're a Democrat, you have a preconceived notion of what that means, and that pretty much means anything. I can't say anything, but it pretty much can confirm to anything nationwide. The same thing with Republicans, and we identify, and so we do have this split within each party where the conservatives from the Democratic side sort of end up moving more toward the Republicans, and the liberal Republicans from the Republican sides tend moving more toward the Democrats. And it's to the point now where in New England today, for example, from New York North into New England, there are no representatives in Congress that are Republicans anymore. There was one, but there haven't. But that was kind of a one-off, I would say, because most of the Senate members of the Senate and the members of the House are Democrats, and in the South, in a lot of places too, you don't see a lot of Democrats that are quote conservative Democrats, and those people that run in those areas as Republicans and Democrats are running on the identification that is present today. You wouldn't see too much of a crossover. in some areas where, the old liberal Republicans in New England, I lived in New England. There are a few, but not that many. So, I don't know. People can confirm that later on.
So, let's spinning off of that, I can elaborate a little bit on the pertinent issues that I think Jack brought up. From the outset, I do want to say that, for example, Michael J. Harrington from Massachusetts, who's one of the Democrats that Jack was mentioning, there's a lot of focus on curbing war powers, and of course we have the Privacy Act and the Federal Registry, and how much the federal government, right, and even state governments too, and municipal governments know about you and can release information on you. And I think to a certain extent, the wave of Democrats, both before Watergate. The Privacy Act in '74. The wave of Democrats that we see, there's an emphasis on the so-called Watergate babies, which so named because they came in the midterm elections after in '74 after Watergate. But actually, there was the Democrats were kind of maintaining, or at least younger Democrats, so in quotes, were gaining seats in Congress at that time. The Congressional War Powers Resolution was actually passed, or actually proposed in '73. And then they also, in '74, the Congressional Budget Office is established. And then of '74, again, we also have the Privacy Act restrictions. And again, there's again this focus on what the federal, not just the knowledge of the federal government has on you and in terms of surveillance, but also what they can release to not just the domestic news media, but people around the world. And then, of course, in the mid to late '70s, there's a burgeoning focus on this kind of distinction between overt and covert action, and CIA expenditures by the CIA. And I think Michael J. Harrington from Massachusetts, not the Michael Harrington from the Other America Michael Harrington that was the basis of the War on Poverty, but this is Michael J. Harrington from Massachusetts, really came out and critiqued all this kind of covert funding going on. And I think collectively these Democrats were known as the Watergate babies. But again, I want to emphasize some of them gained their seats before Watergate. And it wasn't just in the House of Representatives. We're kind of connecting with the House of Representatives. There's a lot of research now, and I'm sure all the panelists here and some of our listeners are familiar with. But here in California, we had Jerry Brown, right, was elected. And then in Massachusetts, I think people are aware of the governor, Michael Dukakis. And then, we have Governor Grasso in Connecticut, and Gary Hart in Colorado. And I can just go a slew of peoples elected that were not just into the House of Representatives, but also to state governments. There's a question on the chat about Bill Clinton in Arkansas. Bill Clinton actually lost his first go around for federal Congress, purportedly because it was a pretty red district that he ran in. But I think that warrants, further inquiry. So there was this idea that when these Democrats came into office, and again, I've addressed, and I do want to emphasize that the focus on the federal level with the Privacy Acts and the Congressional War Powers Resolution, the budget, all of that is directly spinning out of Watergate. And the moniker of Watergate babies, I think, is appropriate for those reasons. But again, there's more research too on another side of things. We have Michael J. Harrington, for example, establishes, along with criticizing the CIA, curbing the power of the presidency, the imperial presidency, and challenging the idea of the imperial presidency started, many historians argue, or at least expanded by Truman, who was a Democrat. ironically. But Michael J. Harrington also organizes the Congressional Coalition of Democrats to change federal subsidies and formulas for federal subsidies to foster more kind of regional economic planning. The idea here was to use federal funds to really expand, certain sectors, and eventually, as we all know, certain sectors becomes tech. And I'll get into that in a second. I do want to reiterate that there is a politics of austerity here, right? A major politics of austerity here with, Dukakis. I think, in Massachusetts, he's like on the streetcar going to work or whatever, and he's not, out there spending all this money. And I think that's also part and parcel too with Watergate. Watergate is looked at not just as the federal government kind of, this kind of corrupt federal government, but it's also becomes, I think, in popular consciousness, the embodiment of too much, not just too much government, but just too much power, particularly in the presidency. Because actually, they use government. These Democrats are actually using government to mobilize, federal funds, and a lot of this has to do with, they turn to the Southern Growth Policies Board, the SGPB, which is based at the North Carolina's Research Triangle Institute, and I think the idea here, both on the federal state level, is to take, provide subsidies basically for startups in the private sector. And it's much more complicated and it's much more longer. And I can go much more detail if you want, but I'm just going to do this in a nutshell. And take federal, state, and local subsidies and sort of jumpstart certain private post-industrial endeavors. And a lot of that initially becomes tech. Okay. Now, where do these federal, state, and local subsidies come from? A lot of them come from actually property taxes. Okay, and not just the property taxes for these startups, but it also could just be widespread property taxes, like in basically real estate taxes, and that turns into kind of a supply loop where property taxes are raised, the revenue from the taxes are then put into new post-industrial sectors. And there's a lot of emphasis from Southern, they actually consult Southern advisors who argue that this plan will generate some sort of post-racial future, that this will work, taking state funds and expanding it will work, and it'll also solve certain racial tensions that you see like in Massachusetts in '74. And I think to a certain extent there's a lot of criticism of using the funds for any kind of industrial infrastructure, right? I mean, there's issues with infrastructure, as we all know, or funding it, but I think there's definitely a de-emphasis on using state and federal funds for industrial expansion. So I'm sure the idea and word that you are familiar with, post-industrial, comes into play, right? I do want to note here too that in terms of many of the so-called Southern advisors in Congress that are promoting this and promoting the Northeast and the West implementing this plan, there are questions regarding their ongoing historical questions regarding the relationship. I mean, we have Kennedy's former Commerce Secretary, the North Carolina, I don't think he was North Carolina governor, Luther Hodges. He was a bridge between the Southern Democrats, the so-called Southern Democrats who remained in the party, as many of them were leaving for the Republican Party, as we've noted, and these kind of new I suppose, New South, I don't like using the moniker New South, but New South Democrats like Jimmy Carter, who headed up that SPG board that I mentioned. And really, so there's certain key kind of older Southern Democrat figures that are acting as a bridge and introducing other, congressmen like Dukakis, governors like Dukakis, and congressmen like Michael J. Harrington to these younger Southern Democrats. And the Southern Democrats, when I say younger, I mean some of these people are in their like 40s and 50s. So how about new Southern Democrats in Congress to congressmen from the Northeast and from like California, et cetera, et cetera. I do want to emphasize here that much ado has been made about them, these Southern kind of consultants arguing that there's going to be kind of a post-racial future where if we can get through property taxes and other modes of revenue, state governments and municipal governments, even the federal government, can revive post-industrial economies, particularly through subsidizing the tech sector. There's temporalities here. There's an argument that later on they de-emphasize funding or they emphasize a focus on civil rights legislation or social welfare policy or any kind of social welfare, and focus more and more on this plan to fund what amounts to tech startups. And I think that there wasn't necessarily a change through time, though. I think if you play around, they were playing around with the temporalities. There's just more an emphasis on the future. There's a lot of ideas of futurism that are circulating, and that the future, that this will work, right? There's a hope that this will work, and that these post-industrial plans will revive the economy, and not just the economy, but that's also linked to racial tensions too. Okay. So I think in terms of that, we really head into the late 70s, and I do want to once again kind of at the risk of redundancy, remind listeners that these plans coming out of Watergate really they pertain to Watergate because, again, it was this new idea that Watergate was linked to a kind of a government, an old decrepit government that had become corrupt, that had spent too much, or not so much spent too much, but had approached fiscal and monetary policy in error. And I think a lot of these new Democrats saw themselves as, or at least saw some of their ideas as solving and repudiating what came before. And so Watergate becomes kind of a benchmark for this. Okay. Now their plan pivots again, I think, on a variety of sources of revenue to subsidize what amounts to the tech sector and other post-industrial economic avenues, but they do rely on tax revenue, and that only actually works for a few years, because in the late 70s and early 80s, we see on both sides of the political aisle voters rebelling. We have the so-called tax revolts that are very crucial for understanding what comes after the late 70s and 80s, particularly with the Democratic Party. But we're talking about tax revolts on both sides of the political aisle. And a lot of the voters, they don't know, they're not as familiar with these plans that they're doing with the tech startups. I mean, I know like in California, they have Jerry Brown talking to community colleges about how he's going to introduce computers to the community colleges and all this. But a lot of the voters are paying these, part of this plan are increased property taxes specifically. And a lot of voters aren't into that. I think it starts, the tax revolts actually start really in the South, but kind of go up to Massachusetts. And Dukakis is kind of thrown out of office for that reason and a couple other reasons. And then in the early 80s moves to Jerry Brown. So this post-Watergate plan by these young Democrats does pivot, I think, to a certain extent on taxes to subsidize tech startups, and that kind of goes away. Second, in the long term too, is who are we subsidizing? How long are these subsidies supposed to last for? Are these like in Massachusetts, for example, a lot of the technology organizations were joined together, were kind of jointly implemented by the state government and by private investors. And I know that in terms of audit and auditing, because if there was kind of a government influence, there wasn't a government auditing wasn't seen as necessary, and there's a lot of conflict over that later on. But in sum, I do think Watergate, at least for the Democrats, is really a watershed, because even though their initial plans, because of the tax revolts, aren't implemented, as they initially foresaw, and there are changes in the Democratic Party through the 80s with the DLC and Clinton, it was a watershed, and this kind of idea that a new generation is coming about. And as Jack mentioned, we are now the Democratic Party, and all these kind of previous labels will go away, and we are now the Democratic Party. And was that the fulfillment of the sort of the new left? Is this the new left, or what is this? I think that's an ongoing historical debate.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I didn't really thought about all of the kind of nuts and bolts of the new Democratic Party. So that's great. Thank you for those examples. Just since we are getting a little long on time, I just figured I'd give the opportunity to the rest of you to see if you had any last thoughts you wanted to say on the influence or the kind of long-term consequences of Watergate. Adam, did you have anything to add on that?
Yeah. So I guess with Watergate, one of the long-term lasting legacies for this is that every presidential scandal is going to be compared to it, and the idea or the question is that will it be enough to bring the downfall of an administration? And in that regard, you have like under Reagan, you had Iran-Contra. That was a really big scandal, but his administration weathered it and moved on. With Nixon, I guess Watergate was sort of a means to an end. And as we talked about earlier, the issue of how Nixon achieved political office, how he acted to secure his political future, I think he felt like he needed to do Watergate in order to ensure that they didn't have anything that they could use against him. And in that regard, Nixon's always kind of played, a little fast and loose in order to achieve political success. And so when we compare Watergate to, I like Trump's administration. The idea, the question is, how far can executive privilege really go, and do the people have a right to know, or whenever we talk about conspiracies and cover-ups and all this, Watergate is always going to kind of rise to the top as sort of this benchmark that everything's going to get compared against or to. And I think in many ways it really damages Nixon's legacy, because under his administration, you do have the EPA, you have the Clean Water Act, and one of the things that he was working or fighting against was the rising tide of inflation. And so taking the country off the gold standard, opening up relations with Moscow and Beijing, trying to do so many things. I think even under his administration, they lowered the voting age from 21 to 18 in an effort to try to make it more inclusive, to get more people involved. While at the same time, you have the conspiracies that are in the background that kind of taint everything. So the legacy is, really, it's kind of going to have every administration that follows after it, because it's just going to kind of be this specter that haunts them in the background about what they do, and have they gone too far, and then how will the American people react?
Thank you. And Mike, did you have any last thoughts on this?
Oh, sorry, I did unmute myself there. But yeah, I think he's absolutely right, because I think that the just as a short thing is that we do have this kind of shift now in politics, partly due to that Southern strategy, and of course we have a lot of in the 80s and in the 90s we have a lot of quote unquote party building activities that sort of reinforce this. But at the same time, I think one of the lessons, if there are lessons to be learned from Watergate, is that one of the things that we can say from Watergate is that we know that the system worked at that time. Nixon went all the way with a lot of these issues to try to keep these, like Adam was saying, trying to keep things with executive privilege and so forth. But even the Supreme Court eventually came in and said, look, yes, there is a executive privilege, but it doesn't apply. They kind of defined it at that time, which would be helpful later on when we come across not only the Clinton impeachment, but later the two impeachments of Donald Trump. And they also defined, and I think we have this sort of new kind of political atmosphere that emerges with the press, because from the beginning, here you have the Nixon administration, who really starts to believe that they're really at war with the press, and the press wins. We go all the way to the Supreme Court with New York Times versus the United States, in a 6-3 decision. The government cannot, for the first time in history, the federal government goes to court to prevent something like the Pentagon Papers from being printed. And this is again at the very beginning where Nixon has this thinks we're going to plug these leaks, and because the Pentagon Papers, of course, being the biggest leak of all, and it had nothing to do with Nixon, but it was this mentality that we're in this Cold War and we have to keep a grasp and keep control of things. And I think that what happened, of course, was that the press, we found that there are certain rights out there that the press has, and that we could talk about dynamics and things later. We just don't have enough time. But I think that we do have that notice that since then the press becomes sort of it can become sort of an enemy to many administrations, and it becomes sort of a friend, if you will, in some ways. But every administration since then, from Carter to Reagan to even to Trump, has to in some way, begin to fight the press. The one thing that the Clinton administration did was to expand the press office to the communications office. The president, even today, no matter where he is, no matter what happens in the world, now has to respond to things that are happening in the world on a moment's notice. I mean, so that's just something to think about. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, and thank you. And let's see, I guess just Joel, since you kind of started us off here with all of this stuff, did you have any last thoughts really quickly before we sign off?
I think one of the things we have to be careful about always is not giving Watergate too much credit, but making sure that we give it the proper credit. I know that's easy to say and hard to do. There is no question that Watergate eroded people's trust in government. It had already started with the Vietnam War, although that was less widespread because, there were a number of people right to the very end who supported the war. But we started to see more and more about what was being kept secret, or ended up, as the Pentagon Papers proved, there was a lot of things going on we didn't know about. But Watergate, in many ways, made it worse because Watergate begot the pardon of Nixon by Ford, which definitely upset a lot of people. We then had the Intelligence Committee hearings going on that investigated the FBI, the CIA, and we saw a lot of information come out about that, particularly the assassination plots against Castro. All of these are things that were going on at all times that we never knew about. And as we started to see more and more of these things come out, that belief in government, or that trust in, especially on the federal level, begins to wane. The Intelligence Committee hearings, they do a report dealing with the JFK assassination and what the intelligence committees did or did not do during that investigation, which actually led to the House Select Committee on Assassinations that examined both Martin Luther King and John F. Kennedy's death. And as somebody I think pointed out earlier, this is where these congressional hearings become, not that they weren't important in the past. We saw it during Nixon's when he was in Congress, and we saw it before that. House congressional committees, fact-finding committees are a long process in the government, in the country, but one would lead to the other, and then as happened, once we get into a well-loved president by many people, Reagan, he was actually able to weather the storm, I think partly because he was liked so well. I really do believe that Nixon brought on some of it himself just because of the way people felt about him. But anyway, and we go on from there. There has not been a single president who has not had to have some investigation, some bigger, some smaller. The concept of special prosecutors, even though they were used before Watergate, not really that often. Watergate brought that out. So how we keep track of what the government's doing. There was a period of time where clearly the Congress was stronger than the administration, than the presidency, the office of the president during this period. I don't think anybody could disagree that Ford and Carter had their weaker, were much weaker presidents-wise. Reagan would bring back the strength of the president of the office. But all of these things came out of Watergate and even to the present time. There is so much material available. One of the other things that is secondary to this is how much information there is about Watergate. And I think this is where we start to see more and more that we get to hear different points of view from different people who were involved, that there's so much primary source material available out Watergate that people can get to, and the Nixon White House, and then going forward. Nixon lost court battles to try to protect the tapes. And these are things that we now have access to that anybody can use for any kind of investigation or just to learn more. And I think that's one of the positives that came out of Watergate, where we want more information. And some of these hearings and then later investigations went a long way to coming up with the idea that more information is always better than less. More knowledge is always better than less. And I would say in many ways that would probably be one of the more positive aspects of what came out of Watergate.
Well, I really like the idea of ending it on a positive note. So let's end it there. So thank you all for agreeing to talk about the Watergate and its context and its consequences. And I greatly appreciate you all joining in, and thank you for all your time.
Thanks a lot, Rob, for doing this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you all for joining us today. This episode appears on the Working Historians podcast feed, and you can subscribe to that feed on any podcast app, including Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Lyceum, SoundCloud, whatever else you prefer. That way you won't miss any episodes, and you'll continue to hear about all the other cool stuff that historians do with their lives. If you have any questions or comments for this or any of our other podcasts, please send us an email to workinghistorians@gmail.com or through our Twitter feed at workhistorians. For Jack Green, Eric Morganson, Ryan Tripp, Adam Lehman, and Joel Cherney, I am Rob Denning, and now I'm going to include 18 and a half minutes of silence in commemoration of Richard Nixon. Thank you.